Hi, how's it going? This is Resident of Collinwood for YouTube. Back with another video for you guys and gals. I'm here to give my Macgyver character retrospective. The first ever. This is the character of Murdoc. Now, he was played by actor Michael Desbarres. Excuse me. And the first time he debuts is in Season 2, Episode 18, an episode titled Partners. There's a lot to get to with this character retrospective. It's not just going to be a short thing. This is not going to be 5 minutes. I wish it were. Um, the episode of Partners is really interesting because it's not just the introduction of Murdoc per se, though that is the purpose of the episode, really. But it also has another purpose. It's to give the backstory of when Macgyver first met Pete Thornton, and then soon after began working for him. Um, Pete Thornton, played by the late great Dana Elker, DS alum, obviously. I'm a huge Dark Shadows fan. If you watch this channel, you guys know that I do DS videos pretty frequently. Um, so, and Pete Thornton, he was a spy, if you will, for the Phoenix Foundation. Um, Government employee, if you will, or sorry, for the DXS. Um, then he became the leader of the Phoenix Foundation. He became the guy in charge of that, and he obviously brought Macgyver with him. First into the DXX, then to the Phoenix Foundation. I will say that this episode does a nice job of establishing that. It also does, if you're familiar with Macgyver, you're also familiar with the character of Jack Dalton, played by actor Bruce McGill. And the trio, these three guys, are just fun to watch together in an episode. They just are. Together, they are funny as hell. It's just fun to watch. Um, I think both, Dana Elker, Richard Dean Anderson, Bruce McGill just do a great job together. Uh, So this scene starts off in a junkyard. Now this is not the first Macgyver episode to do that. There's a Macgyver episode back in Macgyver's first season. You would see a lot of opening gambits. Um, they're sort of like mini-sodes, if you will, like short 10, maybe 8-10 minute episodes, if that, to establish the character of Macgyver. And he's in a junkyard in one of those opening gambits. Um, this junkyard that he's not in it alone though. He wasn't in the first one, but in this episode, Partners, Pete Thornton is already there. He's in the car looking for something, and Richard Dean Anderson's character Macgyver, which is the name of the show, he's the main character, obviously. He gets in the car with him. You hear Dana Elker's Pete Thornton say, um, I, I feel like a contortionist in the car. That he felt like a contortionist in the car. And so Macgyver and, Richard Dean Anderson's character Macgyver and Dana Elker's Pete Thornton, he did not like to be called Peter, by the way. They say about getting these sort of, you know, letters or flowers or whatever, and they thought it was from one of them or Jack Dalton. And slowly but surely, well, not slowly, but suddenly they're picked up. Their cards start to get smushed in. They're getting picked up, and MacGyver even says, "I don't think the person who sent this was Jack Dalton." And MacGyver's gonna be right. A lot of this episode is a flashback to when Macgyver and Pete first met and how they first met. And a lot of the way they first met was Macgyver had given a taxi ride to Murdoc. You might want to say, why would he do that to this nut job? Because Murdoc is a psychotic killer. He's a hitman, and but he also has multiple identities. He can look like a woman. A lot of characters I've talked about ripped off from the Shadow, and I'm not saying that's where Michael Dalsbury got the idea from, but I would venture to say he's read some Shadow pulps in his time. Um, I would probably more so say the producers got the idea. Say, hey, let's make him a master of disguise. It's a long look. He's not the only offender. That's all I'll say. So I'm not going to pick on the character or the actor for doing it or the producers. It was a smart call. Um, because you see this woman get in this car, like, okay, what's the big deal of this woman getting it? And you literally do believe it's a woman. I mean, he does the woman's voice, he looks like a woman, he's dressed like a woman. It's like, what's the big deal? Then Pete Thornton starts chasing her, and suddenly, after he stops Pete Thornton from shooting Murdoc. And Pete Thornton says, I ought to have you arrested. I ought to shoot you. And slowly but surely, Pete Thornton explains it. That's a psychotic, that's a wanted fugitive. He's a killer. And even before the final climax of the past, Murdoc not only tries to murder Macgyver before the initial climax. There's so many climaxes in this episode. That's what's interesting about it too, about episodes with the character of Murdoc. That okay, in Pete Thornton's apartment, there's a bomb. Murdoc puts a bomb on Pete Thornton's bed. Macgyver barely gets out of it. Then Murdoc shows up at the hospital dressed as a nurse and tries to kill Jack Dalton, tries to shoot him. And finally, Macgyver recognizes him, and it realizes it's him, and then stops him from doing it, obviously. And then finally, the climax of it all, because what happened, what happens is that before I get to the climax of 7 years ago in the episode, Jack Dalton's cab gets destroyed. You see, one of the climaxes before the climax I just mentioned, I forgot the nurse's scene is last. Um, I'm old, but I'm not going to slip up on this. So even though I did a bit, it's okay. Um, Pete Thornton and Macgyver are in Jack's cab because Macgyver was driving it around obviously for Jack because he's laid up in the hospital. Um, so not because of Murdoc, it just that's just something that happened to Jack. It's Jack Dalton. Um, that's, uh, and so Pete Thornton and Macgyver are there as Murdoc is talking to them, and he reveals that he's a man, and MacGyver's like, "It's a man," and that's when Pete Thornton tells him he's a psychotic killer. You know, he's and psychotic is the right word. I, Listen, I grew up on slashers, Michael Myers, Freddy, Jason, and I'm here to tell you, I don't know how crazy you think those characters are. Murdoc's got them all beat. I mean, he is just purely fucking psychotic. Michael Desbarres does an amazing job. So he's gonna kill Macgyver and Pete Thornton with rocket launchers. Yes, rocket launch bazookas. Um, Macgyver diffuses the situation. He causes the taxi cab to go forward, which incapacitates the two men. The rocket launchers go off. It destroys Jack Dalton's taxi. And when they go to the hospital, explain Jack Dalton that they escaped with their lives. He's like, "But you ruined my taxi." And Pete Thornton's like, "Are you listening to yourself?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm listening to myself. You owe me some money." It's like, really, dude? Um, it's just that funny. So that's when Murdoc comes in dressed as a nurse, and MacGyver sort of at the last minute catches him. So a chase pursues with MacGyver chasing Murdoc and Pete Thornton sort of into behind them. And Murdoc walks into a building, and the building then blows up, is getting ready to be demolished, and then boom, it's demolished. So you're left to wonder, did Murdoc die? You also now what you really learn in this episode too is yes, Murdoch has captured Pete and MacGyver again. He meant to capture all three of them. Inside inside the the back of the truck they're in is a taxi. That's what they were in. Actually, sitting in at the time was a taxi. There's a speaker in the back, and Murdoc's talking to them. And Pete's mad. He's like, "I told you we should have." He goes, "We should have been allowed to search." And Max said, MacGyver did say, he's like, "They Pete, they searched. No, we should have been allowed to search." And I love Richard Dean Anderson's MacGyver character. He's really cool. But Dana Elker really takes charge a bit too here. He does a great job of, and it made sense that they give him the line here too, because really he was Pete. Murdoc was Pete's arch nemesis first before he was MacGyver, so it makes sense that Pete gets that line. That hey, we should have been the ones that searched that building after it came down, to search the ashes and the pile and the rubble and everything. They weren't allowed. What you really are learning is they weren't allowed to search that for whatever reason. It's and you can and here's my thing too. Okay, at the time MacGyver's like a civilian, but with Pete being a government employee, it sort of makes you wonder why wasn't he allowed to search. But that might come into play later. Because you do eventually learn that Murdoc works for a corporation himself called HIT. And no, I'm not making that up. Not in this episode, though. You do learn that he's a hitman. um, I think, well, maybe you do learn that he works for HIT. I do know you learn he's a hitman. Again, I'm old, so. And he likes taking pictures of the victims and sending them to their families. I'm not joking. That's what he does. Murdoc is a sick, sick puppy. Um, in this episode of Partners, they get Pete and Mac get out of the truck. MacGyver helps them get out of the truck, and you know, the bomb is still in the back of the truck. What's interesting because it's going to blow up, and Murdoc is still in the 18-wheeler. He's driving it at Mac and Pete, and finally they get to a ledge, and you've seen Tremors. I'm sure you know what happens. Uh, MacGyver moves, Pete moves. I think it might just be MacGyver. My memory, again, it's been a while since I've seen this episode. Most of it I got right. Um, in the episode itself, the semi truck blows up and it goes over the edge. And they never found Murdoc's body, and that's something you're gonna hear a lot with Murdoc. They never find the body. They never find the body. That's actually something you hear in this episode from the scene that happened 7 years ago. Um, the next episode he appears in is season 3, episode 8, The Widowmaker. MacGyver loses one of his closest friends to basically a climbing accident. I mean, not basically, a climbing accident. And actually, that's something I was shocked at that they kill off this character. But it also tugs at the emotion of MacGyver not wanting to fall in love with somebody, but though somebody falling in love with him. You had met this girl before because you had known that she and Jack Dalton were his best friends, but there was always a little more for her because she was in love with MacGyver. And she tells him, and he's sort of like he cares about her, but he doesn't want to get too close. He his parents, and really you also learn that MacGyver's parents, MacGyver's mom and dad, died in a car accident. So it doesn't necessarily have anything. There's always been the question: did it have to do with MacGyver's job? I mean, you could make that case, but I also think what happened to MacGyver's parents sort of caused him to. He didn't want to get close to somebody and then lose them, and it makes sense. But here, he doesn't physically like push her or anything, but he mentally sort of like pushes her away in a weird way. And he felt that when her ropes cord snapped and she died, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Um, and he blamed himself because he knew that he had pushed her away in a way, and he didn't go back to work. And finally, this girl who worked with MacGyver, Nikki, who was a real hard ass, who's supposed to be isn't exactly BFFs with MacGyver, but they sort of kind of respect each other in a weird fucking way. So she comes up there and she's instead of though Pete tried a little tough love, Nikki's gonna try tougher love. She's such a hard ass. On her way up to the cabin, unbeknownst to her, she runs into Murdoc, and it's Murdoc. It's like, oh my god, lady, do you realize the psycho you're freaking talking to right now? I mean, he's wearing this little get up, this cowboy hat and stuff, and, and you can't, he disguises his voice just a little bit. And it's like, oh my god, Nikki girl, get out your gun and blow that creep away. Because trust me, he'd do the same to you. Now he wants her to lead. He knows where MacGyver is, but he figures he'd kill them both. This is how sick Murdoc's mind really works. So Nikki goes up to the cabin and she's trying to talk MacGyver into coming back into his own lifestyle. You hear messages from Jack Dalton, Bruce McGill's character, Pete Thornton, obviously, Dana Elker's character, and here's Nikki trying to talk to him. Also, you hear a voice message from Pete, MacGyver's grandfather, I believe, in this episode. Um, when Nikki goes up there, she's trying to talk to him, and he's just like, whatever. And she goes, I've never seen you like this. There's no life behind you. It's almost like there's no life behind your eyes, and I've never seen that from you. It's not your fault. You weren't there. And I love the line Richard Dean Anderson says. He says, "She needed something from me, and I pushed her away." And she's like, "Okay, but Nikki wasn't, but or sorry, but forget the girl's name who was climbing with him, but Nikki says the name, and she goes, she was an expert climber too, Mac. It happens. You're blaming yourself for something you didn't do. You can play pity pat, and they're going back to the cabin, and my guy was just like, "Leave me alone." He doesn't want nothing. He doesn't want to talk to Nikki either. And she's like, "I'm not going anywhere. You ain't gonna drive me away from here." She's giving him nothing but attitude back. So they get to the cabin. All of a sudden, there's these pictures up all over the freaking cabin, hanging there, and MacGyver stops dead in his tracks, and he's like, and he's looking at the pictures, and then he's grabbing. She's like, "What's wrong?" He's like, "Did somebody follow you up?" He goes, "Oh my god, oh no." And she's like, "What?" He's like, "It can't be. It can't be." And Michael Desbarrius Murdoc, his character, comes shooting with a flamethrower at that fucking cabin, and it is something to behold. I mean, MacGyver gets an SOS out to the general store because the guy was in the Navy. um, they have to climb the mountain where that girl ended up falling from, and they do climb it. Michael Desbarrius' Murdoc ends up falling from there. Guess what? They don't find a body. uh, this, I have this next episode is my favorite Murdoc episode, and don't get me wrong, I love Halloween Nights. It's a great episode, but I love this episode even more, and that Murdoc, Michael Desbarres appears in. It's season 4, episode 9, Cleo Rocks, for a lot of reasons. It's sort of Murdoc intentionally hires one of MacGyver's good friends, Penny Parker, and Penny Parker. Um, if you're familiar with the MacGyver series, she was somebody who was a recurring character from time to time. Um, who was that woman who played Lois Lane on The Adventures of Superman and Clark? Who am I thinking of? I forget her name, but she's the one who played Penny Parker, and she she's a bit of a goofball. She's a very hyperactive person, but she's very kind at heart. Penny Parker is, and MacGyver's sort of like an older brother to her. Or is like a brother to her, is like the closest in the family to her. And so MacGyver starts coming around the theater to watch Penny's performance and be supportive to her. What friend wouldn't, right? So there's some weird shenanigans going on. Stuff's falling down. The sets are being sabotaged left and right, and all of a sudden there's just this weird note being left, and MacGyver takes the note and he's tries to decipher like what's going on here. Now, let me get into why I like this episode before I give you the reveal. The stage, by the way, the stage manager is in a wheelchair. I think his name is Jacques or something. And yes, the guy in the wheelchair is Michael Desbarres Murdoc. He's wearing this cheap disguise of a stage manager. The reason I like this episode is because Michael Desbarres, who is an actor, but he's also a musician, and he actually writes. There's a song in here called Cleo Rocks, and he's the person who writes it. I actually like that fact about this episode. It's something that people might forget that Michael Desbarres is actually a musician, but he is. He's an actor and a musician. That's a fun fact. It's another reason this is one of my favorite episodes. What's the number one? This is a huge, huge nod to the Phantom of the Opera, and I'm a sucker for the Phantom of the Opera. I love that movie. I love the Phantom of the Opera. You can say it's a musical, you can make fun of me all you'd like. Um, so, obviously, this figure starts haunting Penny Parker. You hear this strange sort of squeaking sound, and lo and behold, Jock reveals himself as obviously Murdoc. You see the burn marks. Pete Thornton gets captured in this. MacGyver reads the note and he figures out it's murder on top of something raw, and he realizes it's Murdoc. Uh, Murdoc goes into a pool full of electricity, and the, guess what? They don't find a body. Yes, he rescues Penny Parker and Pete Thornton. Um, now, there's episodes like Unfinished Business where he doesn't actually physically appear, he only appears in flashback. The next episode he does appear in is one of my all-time favorites, season 5, episode 6, Halloween Nights. For the first time in MacGyver history, MacGyver and Murdoc work together. You heard that right. You heard that right. And you know what? I know I've been spoiling some of this, but I'm not going to spoil that episode because the price of admission alone is fucking worth it. It is an episode to behold, my friends. I know that's a tease, right? And I'm going to leave you with that one. Um, Another great episode is season 5, episode 12, Serenity. And you could say, well, Michael Desbarres only appears in Richard E. Anderson's character MacGyver's dream. Basically, this is MacGyver, an Old West episode of MacGyver. Richard Dean Anderson has a dream that he's in the Old West as one of his ancestors, what's supposed to be one of his ancestors, or as if MacGyver were in the Old West. Um, it's a really cool episode. I like the fact that you get some cool, cool gunslinging from Murdoch in this episode. Everybody just looked like they were having a grand old time in this episode. I'd love to ask Richard Dean Anderson about it. Or Michael Desbarres. It looked like a lot of fun. Um, Season 6, Episode 19, Strictly Business. I don't want to spoil too much of Halloween Nights, but know this. MacGyver helps Murdoch save somebody that was important to Murdoch. And by strictly business, that person ends up getting killed, not because of MacGyver or even Murdoch, but they died in a skiing accident or something. Um, so Murdoch rejoins it, and they said, well, if you kill MacGyver, you can come back. And he goes, okay. So all that stuff about him, MacGyver helping Murdoch out the window. And what's interesting is he ties MacGyver up. He unties him as he gets ready to kill. He goes, there, I saved your life. We're even. Now let the games begin. It's one of the most coldest, sadistic lines I've heard Murdoch say, but it just lets you know how deranged and just if you didn't know how deranged and psychotic the character was, you definitely found out in this episode. Again, Michael did a great job. Obviously, by the way, in this episode, Strictly Business, MacGyver loses a bit of his memory. He gets it back, and Murdoch falls down a mine shaft. Guess what? They don't find a body. Season 6, episode 21, Hindsight. Again, he's not actually in the episode other than through flashbacks, but it's still a fun episode. Season 7, it's Michael Desbarres' final episode of MacGyver. Obsessed. And MacGyver is obsessed with Murdoch. He keeps getting phone calls. He keeps having dreams of MacGyver keeps having dreams of Murdoch. And Murdoch is alive. He's working for this dictator who tries to double cross Murdoch, but Murdoch murders the dictator's men, the dictator's bodyguard. By God, does Murdoch murder some people in this episode? You know who he doesn't murder? MacGyver. And he ends up going off a cliff in a Jeep. Guess what they don't find? A body. What I really love about this episode is the phone call. He picks up the MacGyver picks up the phone, and you hear Michael Desbarres, Murdoch laughing, and Pete says something on the line, and Murdoch and MacGyver's like, yeah, something on the line. It's a great way to send off the character, and it's a lot of fun. Look, he's one of the most, again, I've said psychotic characters. I think Michael Desbarres did a great job playing the character. I hope you guys enjoyed this MacGyver Murdoch character retrospective. You guys have a good night.